Imagine just for a moment that the universe you know is a mistake. Not a metaphorical one, a literal cosmic error. The stars, the laws of physics, your own body, all the result of a botched experiment by a lesser god who does not even realize he is not in charge. That is the unsettling starting point of Gnosticism. And, like any good iceberg, the part most people see at the surface is only a fraction of what is buried underneath. Tonight, we are descending through that iceberg, from the familiar phrases you may have heard in passing, down to obscure names and rituals that were once considered so dangerous, entire empires tried to make them disappear. We will start with concepts that turn up in documentaries and casual debates, then sink through banned gospels, invisible hierarchies of gods, and finally into surviving sects and strange practices that blur the line between history and rumor. By the time we reach the bottom, Gnosticism will look less like a quirky early Christian heresy and more like an alternate universe's creation story that nearly became mainstream. Let us begin where the water is still relatively clear. At number 10, the surface idea of Gnosticism itself. If you stop a reasonably well-read person on the street and ask, "What is Gnosticism?" you will probably hear something like, "It is an early Christian heresy that believed in secret knowledge." That is not wrong, but it is almost comically incomplete. In the late 1st century, in cities like Alexandria and Antioch, you had a crowded spiritual marketplace. Jewish sects, mystery cults, early Christian communities, Greek philosophy, Egyptian religion. Into this mix came teachers claiming that salvation did not come from joining the right church, but from discovering something about yourself, that your true home was not here at all. To them, Gnosis was not trivia or doctrine. It was an abrupt interior shock. A sense, as some texts put it, of remembering who you were before you were born. I have always found it interesting that in these writings, the truly damned are not the obviously wicked. They are the comfortable, the distracted, the ones who never ask, "Why does this world feel slightly wrong?" And that quiet discomfort is our first hint that we are only at the tip of the iceberg. At number 9, the Demiurge and Sophia, or how a god was born by mistake. On the surface level, you may have heard, Gnostics think the God of the Old Testament is evil. The fuller story is stranger, and in its own way, tragic. In several Gnostic myths, there is an unknowable highest god dwelling in a realm called the Pleroma, the fullness of divine life. From this source emanate aeons, divine beings in male-female pairs. One of these is Sophia, wisdom. And this is where things go wrong. Sophia, moved by a desire to create on her own, without her partner or the father's consent, brings forth a being prematurely. The result is the Demiurge, a malformed creator with the body of a serpent and the head of a lion, described in some texts as ignorant, arrogant, and blind. He looks around, sees nothing above him, and declares, "I am God, and there is no other." Now imagine the emotional tone of this myth. A cosmic child born out of bounds who then builds an entire universe because he cannot imagine that he is not supreme. The tragedy is not just that he is wrong, it is that he does not know he is wrong. We will meet him again under other names lower in the iceberg. For now, keep that image in mind. A universe shaped by a god with a fundamental identity problem. At number 8, Archons, the divine prison guards. If the Demiurge is the architect of the material world, the Archons are the wardens. On the commonly discussed level, you will hear that Archons are malevolent cosmic rulers who keep souls trapped in matter. Picture the night sky the way a 2nd century mystic might. Not as empty space, but as layered, living spheres. 7 planetary heavens, each ruled by a power that delights in ignorance and fear. For Gnostic writers, these are not poetic metaphors. They are actual beings who regulate birth, fate, politics. Every law, every empire, every oppressive system becomes, in this reading, an Archon's handiwork. One can almost imagine a small Gnostic group in a Roman city, watching a military parade thunder past and whispering to one another, They think Caesar rules. They have no idea. This view turns daily life into a quiet act of resistance. Paying taxes, obeying laws, even following religious rules might be, in their eyes, cooperating with jailers. It is an unnerving way to look at your own calendar. And if that sounds like a recipe for banned books and hidden doctrines, that is where the iceberg starts to deepen. At number 7, the Nag Hammadi Library and the gospel that refuses to tell a story. In December of 1945, near a town called Nag Hammadi in Upper Egypt, a farmer digging for fertilizer hit something unexpected: a sealed clay jar. Inside were 13 leather-bound codices, over 50 tractates, many of them Gnostic texts that scholars had only heard about from their enemies. Imagine unwrapping brittle papyrus that had been hidden since the 4th century, then suddenly reading, "These are the secret sayings which the living Jesus spoke." No miracles, no crucifixion narrative, just 114 stark sayings, known now as the Gospel of Thomas. In one, Jesus says, "The kingdom is inside of you, and it is outside of you. When you come to know yourselves, you will realize that it is you who are the sons of the living Father." There is no mention of churches, bishops, or creeds. Salvation sounds uncomfortably like self-knowledge. For a modern reader, it feels almost like an alternate cut of Christianity that was quietly left on the editing room floor. We will see why it was cut as we go lower, but for now, Nag Hammadi stands as the moment when the iceberg's hidden mass suddenly broke the surface. At number 6, Aeons, Sethianism, and Valentinianism, competing blueprints of reality. On the intermediate tier, names start multiplying: Aeons, Sethians, Valentinians. To an outsider, it begins to look like an overcomplicated fantasy series. But each system is an attempt to solve one haunting question: how did a perfect source give rise to such a flawed world? In one influential text, the Apocryphon of John, the unknown god emanates a series of aeons culminating in Barbelo, a supreme mother figure. In Sethian circles, the biblical Seth, third son of Adam and Eve, becomes the ancestor of a spiritual race that remembers its origin above the stars. In Valentinian circles, named after the teacher Valentinus in 2nd century Alexandria, the pleroma is a balanced arrangement of 30 aeons in 15 paired syzygies. One of these, Sophia, falls, and everything that follows is an attempt to repair her mistake. You can imagine someone sitting in a lecture hall in Alexandria around the year 140, listening as Valentinus carefully traces these emanations on a wax tablet. This is not wild superstition to him. It is metaphysics. It is psychology. It is a way of saying the fracture you feel inside yourself is echoed in the structure of reality. And that inner fracture is about to become far more personal. At number 5, the material world as prison and the divine spark inside you. By this point in the iceberg, one theme is impossible to miss. Gnostics do not think you are simply a sinner in need of forgiveness. They think you are, in some sense, a kidnapped god. The demiurge, influenced by traces of Sophia's wisdom, creates humanity. But in doing so, he accidentally implants a fragment of the higher light into human beings. This is the divine spark, a tiny piece of the pleroma smuggled behind enemy lines. The irony is sharp. The very being who claims to be the only god ends up creating the one creature capable of realizing he is not. Daily life becomes a strange double exposure. Outwardly, you eat, work, age, obey. Inwardly, if you are lucky, you begin to feel that you do not belong to any of it. I have always found this both unsettling and oddly compassionate. In this view, your sense of alienation is not a pathology. It is a clue. But here is where it gets complicated. Once you say the world is a prison, and only some have the key, what happens to everyone else? At number 4, Barbelo, the Ogdoad, and the 7 Archons by name. On the deep knowledge tier, the map of the invisible world becomes dizzyingly specific. The Sethian texts describe Barbelo as the first thought of God. the mother who stands beside the father and the son. Around them lies the Ogdoad, the eighth sphere of stability above the seven moving heavens. Below that, in the Hebdomad, each planetary level has its own ruler. Ophite sources even give you a roster: Yaldabaoth, Yao, Sabaoth, Adonaios, Elios, Astaphanos, and Horaios. This is no longer vague talk about evil powers. These are names you might whisper during rituals, passwords you might need for the soul's ascent after death. It is a quiet reversal of power. The same titles that ordinary believers used for God in synagogues and churches, Sabaoth, Adonaios, are in these systems demoted to cosmic bureaucrats still within the prison. One can see why bishops at councils in places like Rome or Carthage regarded this as more than an innocent thought experiment. At number 3, fractured sects and strange neighbors, Borborites, Norea, and the Mandaeans. By the 4th century, these movements began to splinter. Church fathers like Epiphanius describe sects with names that sound almost invented: Borborites, Fibionites, Archontics. His accounts are hostile and probably exaggerated, but they preserve the memory of groups that turned Gnostic myth into full communal lifestyle, complete with unusual ritual meals and secrecy. Names from earlier myths also take on new lives. Norea, imagined as the wife of Noah, appears in Scythian texts as a fiery figure who burns the ark's door rather than submitting to the demiurge's plan. She reappears in Mandaean texts and even in Manichaean ones, as if wandering from one scriptural universe to another. Meanwhile, in the marshes of southern Iraq and Iran, a small community survives into the present: the Mandaeans, practicing repeated baptismal rites and venerating figures like John the Baptist. They are not simply leftover Gnostics, but there are enough parallels, hostile view of certain biblical figures, complex heavenly maps, that scholars still debate the connections. To my mind, the unsettling part is this: while most Gnostic groups vanished under imperial pressure, a few quietly kept their rituals by riversides, half hidden from the story that replaced them. At number 2, Autogenes, Bogomils, and the Five Seals. Near the bottom of the iceberg, the lines between Christian heresy, pagan philosophy, and later medieval movements blur. In some Scythian texts, Christ is identified with Autogenes, the self-generated Son, anointed not with oil, but with the invisible Spirit's own Christhood. Salvation becomes less about an event in Jerusalem and more about a timeless descent of a heavenly being into the soul's darkness. Ritually, this is sometimes expressed through the mysterious 5 seals, a phrase that many scholars link to quintuple immersions in water, a kind of extended baptism echoing Mandaean practice. Imagine a small, shivering group entering and re-entering a cold river by torchlight, believing that each plunge peels away another layer of archonic control. Centuries later, in 10th century Bulgaria, a dualist movement called Bogomilism arises, preaching that the visible church has allied itself with the evil creator and that true Christians must reject worldly power. They were influenced by Manichaeism, an earlier currents, and in them some see a late faint echo of the Gnostic suspicion toward the material order. This is where things diverge from neat textbook timelines. Ideas condemned in 1 century have a way of reappearing under new names when conditions feel familiar. And finally, at number 1, Hermetic neighbors and the many faces of the false god. At the very bottom, in the most obscure layer, the iceberg merges with an entire landscape of late antique esotericism. In the Nag Hammadi codices, alongside Christian Gnostic texts, sit 3 Hermetic treatises, pagan works attributed to Hermes Trismegistus, blending Greek philosophy and Egyptian religion. They are not Gnostic in the strict sense, but they share a tone: the world as a school for the soul, secret names for heavenly powers, ascent through planetary spheres. Names for the demiurge also multiply: Yaldabaoth, Saklas, Fool, Samael, Blind God. Sometimes he is the Old Testament creator, sometimes a subordinate, sometimes a metaphor for ignorant authority in any age. It is disturbingly easy to see why modern conspiracies, simulation theories, and certain strands of occultism have adopted this imagery. The idea that someone else is running the show and they are not who they say they are never quite goes out of style. But here is where it gets complicated, and where we have to be careful. Many modern uses of Gnostic flatten a complex second-century spiritual ecosystem into a vague mood. I do not like institutions, so I must be Gnostic. The historical movements we have traced were stranger, more specific, and in their own way, more demanding. They asked people not just to distrust the world, but to reorder their entire sense of self around an invisible homeland. Stepping back from this iceberg, what ties all 10 levels together is a single, unsettling conviction: that the familiar story is not the whole story. That behind official scriptures and imperial creeds, there were other texts, other rituals, other ways of imagining God and the cosmos. Ways that were declared heretical, buried in jars, and almost forgotten. Whether you find these myths persuasive or not, they tell us something enduring about human beings. We are rarely content with the surface. We generate alternative maps, forbidden cosmologies, secret lineages, not only out of rebellion, but out of a deep suspicion that reality is more layered than it appears. In the end, the Gnostic Iceberg is less about siding with heretics or orthodoxy, and more about recognizing how fiercely people have fought over one question: what kind of world is this really? And perhaps that is the quiet challenge these texts still pose. When you feel that something about the world is off, unjust, absurd, strangely hollow, do you shrug and adapt? Do you trust the official explanations? Or do you, like those long-ago readers in Alexandria, start to wonder what might be hidden just below the surface? Thank you for descending through these cold waters. Until next time, take care. And remember that even the most familiar stories may have an underside you have not yet seen.